Part 1. Alcibiades I by Plato. Translated by Benjamin Jowett. Appendix 1. It seems impossible to separate by any exact line the genuine writings of Plato from the spurious. The only external evidence to them which is of much value is that of Aristotle, for the Alexandrian catalogues of a century later include manifest forgeries. Even the value of the Aristotelian authority is a good deal impaired by the uncertainty concerning the date and authorship of the writings which are ascribed to him. And several of the citations of Aristotle omit the name of Plato, and some of them omit the name of the dialogue from which they are taken. Prior, however, to the enquiry about the writings of a particular author, general considerations which equally affect all evidence to the genuineness of ancient writings are the following. Shorter works are more likely to have been forged, or to have received an erroneous designation, than longer ones. And some kinds of composition, such as epistles or panegyrical orations, are more liable to suspicion than others. Those again which have a taste of sophistry in them, or the ring of a later age, or the slighter character of a rhetorical exercise, or in which a motive or some affinity to spurious writings can be detected, or which seem to have originated in a name or statement really occurring in some classical author, are also of doubtful credit. While there is no instance of any ancient writing proved to be a forgery which combines excellence with length, a really great and original writer would have no object in fathering his works on Plato, and to the forger or imitator, the literary hack of Alexandria and Athens, the gods did not grant originality or genius. Further, in attempting to balance the evidence for and against a Platonic dialogue, we must not forget that the form of the Platonic writing was common to several of his contemporaries. Aeschines, Euclid, Phaedo, Antisthenes, and in the next generation Aristotle are all said to have composed dialogues, and mistakes of names are very likely to have occurred. Greek literature in the 3rd century before Christ was almost as voluminous as our own, and without the safeguards of regular publication, or printing, or binding, or even of distinct titles. An unknown writing was naturally attributed to a known writer whose works bore the same character, and the name once appended easily obtained authority. A tendency may also be observed to blend the works and opinions of the master with those of his scholars. To a later Platonist, the difference between Plato and his imitators was not so perceptible as to ourselves. The memorabilia of Xenophon and the dialogues of Plato are but a part of a considerable Socratic literature which has passed away, and we must consider how we should regard the question of the genuineness of a particular writing, if this lost literature had been preserved to us. These considerations lead us to adopt the following criteria of genuineness. 1. That is most certainly Plato's which Aristotle attributes to him by name, which 2. Is of considerable length, of 3. Great excellence, and also 4. In harmony with the general spirit of the Platonic writings. But the testimony of Aristotle cannot always be distinguished from that of a latter age (see above), and has various degrees of importance. Those writings which he cites without mentioning Plato under their own names, e.g. the Hippias, the Funeral Oration, the Phaedo, etc., have an inferior degree of evidence in their favor. They may have been supposed by him to be the writings of another, although in the case of really great works, e.g. the Phaedo, this is not credible. Those again which are quoted but not named are still more defective in their external credentials. There may be also a possibility that Aristotle was mistaken, or may have confused the master and his scholars in the case of a short writing, but this is inconceivable about a more important work, e.g. the Laws, especially when we remember that he was living at Athens and a frequenter of the groves of the Academy during the last 20 years of Plato's life. Nor must we forget that in all his numerous citations from the Platonic writings, he never attributes any passage found in the extant dialogues to anyone but Plato. And lastly, we may remark that one or two great writings, such as the Parmenides and the Politicus, which are wholly devoid of Aristotelian credentials, may be fairly attributed to Plato on the ground of 2, length, 3, excellence, and 4, accordance with the general spirit of his writings. Indeed, the greater part of the evidence for the genuineness of ancient Greek authors may be summed up under 2 heads only: 1, excellence, and 2, uniformity of tradition. A kind of evidence which, though in many cases sufficient, is of inferior value. Proceeding upon these principles, we appear to arrive at the conclusion that 19/20ths of all the writings which have ever been ascribed to Plato are undoubtedly genuine. There is another portion of them, including the epistles, the eponomis, the dialogues rejected by the ancients themselves, namely the Axiarchus, De Justo, De Virtute, Demodocus, Sisyphus, Eryxias, which on grounds both of internal and external evidence we are able with equal certainty to reject. But there still remains a small portion of which we are unable to affirm either that they are genuine or spurious. They may have been written in youth, or possibly, like the works of some painters, may be partly or wholly the compositions of pupils, or they may have been the writings of some contemporary transferred by accident to the more celebrated name of Plato, or of some Platonist in the next generation who aspired to imitate his master. Not that on grounds either of language or philosophy we should lightly reject them. Some difference of style, or inferiority of execution, or inconsistency of thought can hardly be considered decisive of their spurious character. For who always does justice to himself, or who writes with equal care at all times? Certainly not Plato, who exhibits the greatest differences in dramatic power, in the formation of sentences, and in the use of words. If his earlier writings are compared with his later ones, say the Protagoras or Phaedrus with the Laws, or who can be expected to think in the same manner during a period of authorship extending over above 50 years, in an age of great intellectual activity, as well as of political and literary transition? Certainly not Plato, whose earlier writings are separated from his later ones by as wide an interval of philosophical speculation as that which separates his later writings from Aristotle. The dialogues which have been translated in the first appendix, and which appear to have the next claim to genuineness among the Platonic writings, are the Lesser Hippias, the Menexenus or funeral oration, the first Alcibiades. Of these, the Lesser Hippias and the funeral oration are cited by Aristotle, the first in the Metaphysics, the latter in the Rhetoric. Neither of them are expressly attributed to Plato, but in his citation of both of them he seems to be referring to passages in the extant dialogues. From the mention of Hippias in the singular by Aristotle, we may perhaps infer that he was unacquainted with the second dialogue bearing the same name. Moreover, the mere existence of a greater and lesser Hippias, and of a first and second Alcibiades, does to a certain extent throw a doubt upon both of them. Though a very clever and ingenious work, the Lesser Hippias does not appear to contain anything beyond the power of an imitator, who was also a careful student of the earlier Platonic writings, to invent. The motive or leading thought of the dialogue may be detected in Xenophon Memorabilia, and there is no similar instance of a motive which is taken from Xenophon in an undoubted dialogue of Plato. On the other hand, the upholders of the genuineness of the dialogue will find in the Hippias a true Socratic spirit. They will compare the Ion as being akin both in subject and treatment. They will urge the authority of Aristotle, and they will detect in the treatment of the Sophist, in the satirical reasoning upon Homer, in the reductio ad absurdum of the doctrine that vice is ignorance, traces of a Platonic authorship. In reference to the last point we are doubtful, as in some of the other dialogues. whether the author is asserting or overthrowing the paradox of Socrates, or merely following the argument whither the wind blows. That no conclusion is arrived at is also in accordance with the character of the earlier dialogues. The resemblances or imitations of the Gorgias, Protagoras, and Euthydemus, which have been observed in the Hippias, cannot with certainty be adduced on either side of the argument. On the whole, more may be said in favour of the genuineness of the Hippias than against it. The Menexenus, or funeral oration, is cited by Aristotle, and is interesting as supplying an example of the manner in which the orators praised the Athenians among the Athenians, falsifying persons and dates, and casting a veil over the gloomier events of Athenian history. It exhibits an acquaintance with the funeral oration of Thucydides, and was perhaps intended to rival that great work. If genuine, the proper place of the Menexenus would be at the end of the Phaedrus. The satirical opening and the concluding words bear a great resemblance to the earlier dialogues. The oration itself is professedly a mimetic work, like the speeches in the Phaedrus, and cannot therefore be tested by a comparison of the other writings of Plato. The funeral oration of Pericles is expressly mentioned in the Phaedrus, and this may have suggested the subject, in the same manner that the Cleitophon appears to be suggested by the slight mention of Cleitophon and his attachment to Thrasymachus in the Republic, and the Theages by the mention of Theages in the Apology and Republic, or as the second Alcibiades seems to be founded upon the text of Xenophon, Memorabilia. A similar taste for parody appears not only in the Phaedrus, but in the Protagoras, in the Symposium, and to a certain extent in the Parmenides. To these two doubtful writings of Plato, I have added the first Alcibiades, which, of all the disputed dialogues of Plato, has the greatest merit, and is somewhat longer than any of them, though not verified by the testimony of Aristotle, and in many respects at variance with the Symposium in the description of the relations of Socrates and Alcibiades. Like the Lesser Hippias and the Menexenus, it is to be compared to the earlier writings of Plato. The motive of the piece may perhaps be found in that passage of the Symposium in which Alcibiades describes himself as self-convicted by the words of Socrates. For the disparaging manner in which Schleiermacher has spoken of this dialogue, there seems to be no sufficient foundation. At the same time, the lesson imparted is simple, and the irony more transparent than in the undoubted dialogues of Plato. We know too that Alcibiades was a favourite thesis, and that at least 5 or 6 dialogues bearing this name passed current in antiquity, and are attributed to contemporaries of Socrates and Plato. 1. In the entire absence of real external evidence, for the catalogues of Alexandrian librarians cannot be regarded as trustworthy, and 2. In the absence of the highest marks either of poetical or philosophical excellence, and 3. Considering that we have expressed testimony to the existence of contemporary writings bearing the name of Alcibiades, we are compelled to suspend our judgment on the genuineness of the extant dialogue. Neither at this point, nor at any other, do we propose to draw an absolute line of demarcation between genuine and spurious writings of Plato. They fade off imperceptibly from one class to another. There may have been degrees of genuineness in the dialogues themselves, as there are certainly degrees of evidence by which they are supported. The traditions of the oral discourses both of Socrates and Plato may have formed the basis of semi-Platonic writings. Some of them may be of the same mixed character which is apparent in Aristotle and Hippocrates, although the form of them is different. But the writings of Plato, unlike the writings of Aristotle, seem never to have been confused with the writings of his disciples. This was probably due to their definite form and to their inimitable excellence. The 3 dialogues which we have offered in the appendix to the criticism of the reader may be partly spurious and partly genuine. They may be altogether spurious. That is an alternative which must be frankly admitted. Nor can we maintain of some other dialogues, such as the Parmenides, and the Sophist, and Politicus, that no considerable objection can be urged against them, though greatly overbalanced by the weight, chiefly, of internal evidence in their favour. Nor, on the other hand, can we exclude a bare possibility that some dialogues which are usually rejected, such as the Greater Hippias and the Cleitophon, may be genuine. The nature and object of these semi-Platonic writings require more careful study and more comparison of them with one another, and with forged writings in general, than they have yet received, before we can finally decide on their character. We do not consider them all as genuine until they can be proved to be spurious, as is often maintained and still more often implied in this and similar discussions, but should say of some of them that their genuineness is neither proven nor disproven until further evidence about them can be adduced, and we are as confident that the epistles are spurious as that the Republic, the Timaeus, and the Laws are genuine. On the whole, not a 20th part of the writings which pass under the name of Plato, if we exclude the works rejected by the ancients themselves, and 2 or 3 other plausible inventions, can be fairly doubted by those who are willing to allow that a considerable change and growth may have taken place in his philosophy. (See above end of parentheses). That 20th debatable portion scarcely in any degree affects our judgment of Plato, either as a thinker or a writer, and though suggesting some interesting questions to the scholar and critic, is of little importance to the general reader. Alcibiades I. Introduction. The first Alcibiades is a conversation between Socrates and Alcibiades. Socrates is represented in the character which he attributes to himself in the Apology of a know-nothing who detects the conceit of knowledge in others. The two have met already in the Protagoras and in the Symposium. In the latter dialogue, as in this, the relation between them is that of a lover and his beloved, but the narrative of their loves is told differently in different places. For in the Symposium Alcibiades is depicted as the impassioned but rejected lover, here as coldly receiving the advances of Socrates, who, for the best of purposes, lies in wait for the aspiring and ambitious youth. Alcibiades, who is described as a very young man, is about to enter on public life, having an inordinate opinion of himself and an extravagant ambition. Socrates, who knows what is in man, astonishes him by a revelation of his designs. But has he the knowledge which is necessary for carrying them out? He is going to persuade the Athenians about what? Not about any particular art, but about politics, when to fight and when to make peace. Now, men should fight and make peace on just grounds, and therefore the question of justice and injustice must enter into peace and war, and he who advises the Athenians must know the difference between them. Does Alcibiades know? If he does, he must either have been taught by some master, or he must have discovered the nature of them himself. If he has had a master, Socrates would like to be informed who he is, that he may go and learn of him also. Alcibiades admits that he has never learned. Then has he inquired for himself? He may have, if he was ever aware of a time when he was ignorant. But he never was ignorant, for when he played with other boys at dice, he charged them with cheating, and this implied a knowledge of just and unjust. According to his own explanation, he had learned of the multitude. Why, he asks, should he not learn of them the nature of justice, as he has learned the Greek language of them? To this Socrates answers that they can teach Greek, but they cannot teach justice. For they are agreed about the one, but they are not agreed about the other. And therefore Alcibiades, who has admitted that if he knows he must either have learned from a master or have discovered for himself the nature of justice, is convicted out of his own mouth. Alcibiades rejoins, that the Athenians debate not about what is just, but about what is expedient. And he asserts that the two principles of justice and expediency are opposed. Socrates, by a series of questions, compels him to admit that the just and the expedient coincide. Alcibiades is thus reduced to the humiliating conclusion that he knows nothing of politics, even if, as he says, they are concerned with the expedient. However, he is no worse than other Athenian statesmen, and he will not need training, for others are as ignorant as he is. He is reminded that he has to contend not only with his own countrymen, but with their enemies, with the Spartan kings and with the great king of Persia, and he can only attain this higher aim of ambition by the assistance of Socrates. Not that Socrates himself professes to have attained the truth, but the questions which he asks bring others to a knowledge of themselves, and this is the first step in the practice of virtue. The dialogue continues. We wish to become as good as possible, but to be good in what? Alcibiades replies, good in transacting business? But what business? The business of the most intelligent men at Athens. The cobbler is intelligent in shoemaking, and is therefore good in that. He is not intelligent, and therefore not good in weaving. Is he good in the sense which Alcibiades means, who is also bad? I mean, replies Alcibiades, the man who is able to command in the city. But to command what? Horses or men? And if men, under what circumstances? I mean to say that he is able to command men living in social and political relations. And what is their aim? The better preservation of the city. But when is a city better? When there is unanimity, such as exists between husband and wife. Then, when husbands and wives perform their own special duties, there can be no unanimity between them, nor can a city be well ordered when each citizen does his own work only. Alcibiades, having stated first that goodness consists in the unanimity of the citizens, and then in each of them doing his own separate work, is brought to the required point of self-contradiction, leading him to confess his own ignorance. But he is not too old to learn, and may still arrive at the truth, if he is willing to be cross-examined by Socrates. He must know himself, that is to say, not his body, or the things of the body, but his mind, or truer self. The physician knows the body, and the tradesman knows his own business, but they do not necessarily know themselves. Self-knowledge can be obtained only by looking into the mind and virtue of the soul, which is the diviner part of a man, as we see our own image in another's eye. And if we do not know ourselves, we cannot know what belongs to ourselves or belongs to others, and are unfit to take a part in political affairs, both for the sake of the individual and of the state. We ought to aim at justice and temperance, not at wealth or power. The evil and unjust should have no power. They should be the slaves of better men than themselves. None but the virtuous are deserving of freedom. And are you, Alcibiades, a free man? I feel that I am not, but I hope, Socrates, that by your aid I may become free, and from this day forward I will never leave you. The Alcibiades has several points of resemblance to the undoubted dialogues of Plato. The process of interrogation is of the same kind with that which Socrates practices upon the youthful Cleinias in the Euthydemus, and he characteristically attributes to Alcibiades the answers which he has elicited from him. The definition of good is narrowed by successive questions, and virtue is shown to be identical with knowledge. Here, as elsewhere, Socrates awakens the consciousness not of sin, but of ignorance. Self-humiliation is the first step to knowledge, even of the commonest things. No man knows how ignorant he is, and no man can arrive at virtue and wisdom who has not once in his life, at least, been convicted of error. The process by which the soul is elevated is not unlike that which religious writers describe under the name of conversion, if we substitute the sense of ignorance for the consciousness of sin. In some respects, the dialogue differs from any other Platonic composition. The aim is more directly ethical and hortatory. The process by which the antagonist is undermined is simpler than in other Platonic writings, and the conclusion more decided. There is a good deal of humor in the manner in which the pride of Alcibiades, and of the Greeks generally, is supposed to be taken down by the Spartan and Persian queens, and the dialogue has considerable dialectical merit. But we have a difficulty in supposing that the same writer, who has given so profound and complex a notion of the characters both of Alcibiades and Socrates in the Symposium, should have treated them in so thin and superficial a manner in the Alcibiades, or that he would have ascribed to the ironical Socrates the rather unmeaning boast that Alcibiades could not attain the objects of his ambition without his help, or that he should have imagined that a mighty nature like his could have been reformed by a few not very conclusive words of Socrates. For the arguments by which Alcibiades is reformed are not convincing. The writer of the dialogue, whoever he was, arrives at his idealism by crooked and tortuous paths, in which many pitfalls are concealed. The anachronism of making Alcibiades about 20 years old during the life of his uncle, Pericles, may be noted, and the repetition of the favourite observation which occurs also in the Laches and Protagoras. The great Athenian statesmen, like Pericles, failed in the education of their sons. There is none of the undoubted dialogues of Plato in which there is so little dramatic verisimilitude. Section 2 of Alcibiades I by Plato. Persons of the dialogue. Alcibiades, Socrates. Socrates. I dare say that you may be surprised to find, O son of Cleinias, that I, who am your first lover, not having spoken to you for many years, when the rest of the world were wearying you with their attentions, am the last of your lovers who still speaks to you. The cause of my silence has been that I was hindered by a power more than human, of which I will some day explain to you the nature. This impediment has now been removed. I therefore here present myself before you, and I greatly hope that no similar hindrance will again occur. Meanwhile, I have observed that your pride has been too much for the pride of your admirers. They were numerous and high-spirited, but they have all run away, overpowered by your superior force of character. Not one of them remains. And I want you to understand the reason why you have been too much for them. You think that you have no need of them or of any other man, for you have great possessions and lack nothing, beginning with the body and ending with the soul. In the first place, you say to yourself that you are the fairest and tallest of the citizens, and this everyone who has eyes may see to be true. In the second place, that you are among the noblest of them, highly connected both on the father's and the mother's side, and sprung from one of the most distinguished families in your own state, which is the greatest in Hellas, and having many friends and kinsmen of the best sort, who can assist you when in need. And there is one potent relative who is more to you than all the rest, Pericles, the son of Xanthippus, whom your father left guardian of you, and of your brother, and who can do as he pleases not only in this city, but in all Hellas, and among many and mighty barbarous nations. Moreover, you are rich, but I must say that you value yourself least of all upon your possessions, and all these things have lifted you up. You have overcome your lovers, and they have acknowledged that you were too much for them. Have you not remarked their absence? And now I know that you wonder why I, unlike the rest of them, have not gone away, and what can be my motive in remaining. Alcibiades. Perhaps, Socrates, you are not aware that I was just going to ask you the very same question. What do you want? And what is your motive in annoying me, and always, wherever I am, making a point of coming? Parentheses, compare symposium, end of parentheses. I do really wonder what you mean, and should greatly like to know. Socrates, then if, as you say, you desire to know, I suppose that you will be willing to hear, and I may consider myself to be speaking to an auditor who will remain, and will not run away. Alcibiades, certainly, let me hear. Socrates, you had better be careful, for I may very likely be as unwilling to end as I have hitherto been to begin. Alcibiades, proceed, my good man, and I will listen. Socrates, I will proceed, and although no lover likes to speak with one who has no feeling of love in him, parentheses, compare symposium, end of parentheses, I will make an effort, and tell you what I meant. My love, Alcibiades, which I hardly like to confess, would long ago have passed away, as I flatter myself, if I saw you loving your good things, or thinking that you ought to pass life in the enjoyment of them. But I shall reveal other thoughts of yours, which you keep to yourself, whereby you will know that I have always had my eye on you. Suppose that at this moment some god came to you and said, Alcibiades, will you live as you are, or die in an instant if you are forbidden to make any further acquisition? I verily believe that you would choose death, and I will tell you the hope in which you are at present living. Before many days have elapsed, you think that you will come before the Athenian assembly, and will prove to them that you are more worthy of honor than Pericles, or any other man that ever lived, and having proved this, you will have the greatest power in this state. When you have gained the greatest power among us, you will go on to the other Hellenic states, and not only to Hellenes, but to all the barbarians who inhabit the same continent with us. And if the god were then to say to you again, here in Europe is to be your seat of empire, and you must not cross over into Asia or meddle with Asiatic affairs, I do not believe that you would choose to live upon these terms, but the world, as I may say, must be filled with your power and name. No man less than Cyrus and Xerxes is of any account with you. Such I know to be your hopes. I am not guessing only, and very likely you, who know that I am speaking the truth, will reply, well, Socrates, but what have my hopes to do with the explanation which you promised of your unwillingness to leave me? And that is what I am now going to tell you, sweet son of Cleinias and Dinomache. The explanation is that all these designs of yours cannot be accomplished by you without my help. So great is the power which I believe myself to have over you and your concerns. And this I conceive to be the reason why the god has hitherto forbidden me to converse with you. And I have been long expecting his permission. For, as you hope to prove your own great value to the state, and having proved it, to attain at once to absolute power, so do I indulge a hope that I shall be the supreme power over you, if I am able to prove my own great value to you, and to show you that neither guardian, nor kinsman, nor any one is able to deliver into your hands the power which you desire, but I only, God being my helper. When you were young, parentheses, compare symposium, end of parentheses, and your hopes were not yet matured, I should have wasted my time, and therefore, as I conceive, the god forbade me to converse with you, but now, having his permission, I will speak, for now you will listen to me. Alcibiades, your silence, Socrates, was always a surprise to me. I never could understand why you followed me about, and now that you have begun to speak again, I am still more amazed. Whether I think all this or not is a matter about which you seem to have already made up your mind, and therefore my denial will have no effect upon you. But granting, if I must, that you have perfectly divined my purposes, why is your assistance necessary to the attainment of them? Can you tell me why? Socrates: You want to know whether I can make a long speech, such as you are in the habit of hearing, but that is not my way. I think, however, that I can prove to you the truth of what I am saying, if you will grant me one little favor. Alcibiades: Yes, if the favor which you mean be not a troublesome one. Socrates: Will you be troubled at having questions to answer? Alcibiades: Not at all. Socrates: Then please to answer. Alcibiades: Ask me. Socrates: Have you not the intention which I attribute to you? Alcibiades: I will grant anything you like, in the hope of hearing what more you have to say. Socrates: You do then mean, as I was saying, to come forward in a little while in the character of an adviser of the Athenians. And suppose that when you are ascending the bema, I pull you by the sleeve and say, Alcibiades, you are getting up to advise the Athenians. Do you know the matter about which they are going to deliberate better than they? How would you answer? Alcibiades: I should reply that I was going to advise them about a matter which I do know better than they. Socrates: Then you are a good adviser about the things which you know. Alcibiades: Certainly. Socrates: And do you know anything but what you have learned of others, or found out yourself? Alcibiades: That is all. Socrates: And would you have ever learned or discovered anything if you had not been willing either to learn of others or to examine yourself? Alcibiades: I should not. Socrates: And would you have been willing to learn or to examine what you supposed that you knew? Alcibiades: Certainly not. Socrates: Then there was a time when you thought that you did not know what you are now supposed to know. Alcibiades: Certainly. Socrates: I think that I know tolerably well the extent of your requirements, and you must tell me if I forget any of them. According to my recollection, you learned the arts of writing, of playing on the lyre, and of wrestling. The flute you never would learn. This is the sum of your accomplishments, unless there were some which you acquired in secret, and I think that secrecy was hardly possible, as you could not have come out of your door, either by day or night, without my seeing you. Alcibiades: Yes, that was the whole of my schooling. Socrates: And are you going to get up in the Athenian assembly and give them advice about writing? Alcibiades: No, indeed. Socrates: Or about the touch of the lyre? Alcibiades: Certainly not. Socrates: And they are not in the habit of deliberating about wrestling in the assembly? Alcibiades: Hardly. Socrates: Then what are the deliberations in which you propose to advise them? Surely not about building. Alcibiades: No. Socrates: For the builder will advise better than you will about that. Alcibiades: He will. Socrates: Nor about divination. Alcibiades: No. Socrates: About that again the diviner will advise better than you will. Alcibiades: True. Socrates: Whether he be little or great, good or ill-looking, noble or ignoble, makes no difference. Alcibiades: Certainly not. Socrates: A man is a good adviser about anything, not because he has riches, but because he has knowledge. Alcibiades: Assuredly. Socrates: Whether their counselor is rich or poor is not a matter which will make any difference to the Athenians when they are deliberating about the health of the citizens. They only require that he should be a physician. Alcibiades: Of course. Socrates: Then what will be the subject of deliberation about which you will be justified in getting up and advising them? Alcibiades: About their own concerns, Socrates. Socrates: You mean about shipbuilding, for example, when the question is what sort of ships they ought to build? Alcibiades: No, I should not advise them about that. Socrates: I suppose because you do not understand shipbuilding. Is that the reason? Alcibiades: It is. Socrates: Then about what concerns of theirs will you advise them? Alcibiades: about war, Socrates, or about peace, or about any other concerns of the state. Socrates: you mean when they deliberate with whom they ought to make peace, and with whom they ought to go to war, and in what manner. Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: and they ought to go to war with those against whom it is better to go to war. Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: and when it is better. Alcibiades: certainly. Socrates: and for as long a time as is better. Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: but suppose the Athenians to deliberate with whom they ought to close in wrestling, and whom they should grasp by the hand, would you, or the master of gymnastics, be a better adviser of them? Alcibiades: clearly the master of gymnastics. Socrates: and can you tell me on what grounds the master of gymnastics would decide with whom they ought or ought not to close, and when and how? To take an instance, would he not say that they should wrestle with those against whom it is best to wrestle? Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: and as much as is best? Alcibiades: certainly. Socrates: and at such times as are best? Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: again, you sometimes accompany the lyre with the song and dance. Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: when it is well to do so. Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: and as much as is well. Alcibiades: just so. Socrates: and as you speak of an excellence or art of the best in wrestling, and of an excellence in playing the lyre, I wish you would tell me what this latter is. The excellence of wrestling I call gymnastic, and I want to know what you call the other. Alcibiades: I do not understand you. Socrates: then try to do as I do, for the answer which I gave is universally right, and when I say right, I mean according to rule. Alcibiades: yes. Socrates: and was not the art of which I spoke gymnastic? Alcibiades: certainly. Socrates: and I called the excellence in wrestling gymnastic. Alcibiades: you did. Socrates: and I was right. Alcibiades: I think that you were. Socrates: well now, for you should learn to argue prettily. Let me ask you in return to tell me, first, what is that art of which playing and singing, and stepping properly in the dance, are parts? What is the name of the whole? I think that by this time you must be able to tell. Alcibiades: indeed I cannot. Socrates: then let me put the matter in another way. What do you call the goddesses who are the patronesses of art? Alcibiades: the muses, do you mean, Socrates? Socrates: yes, I do. And what is the name of the art which is called after them? Alcibiades: I suppose that you mean music. Socrates: yes, that is my meaning. And what is the excellence of the art of music? As I told you truly that the excellence of wrestling was gymnastic, what is the excellence of music? To be what? Alcibiades: to be musical, I suppose. Socrates: very good. And now please to tell me what is the excellence of war and peace, as the more musical was the more excellent, or the more gymnastical was the more excellent. Tell me, what name do you give to the more excellent in war and peace? Alcibiades: but I really cannot tell you. Socrates: but if you were offering advice to another and said to him, this food is better than that, at this time and in this quantity, and he said to you, what do you mean, Alcibiades, by the word better? You would have no difficulty in replying that you meant more wholesome, although you do not profess to be a physician. And when the subject is one of which you profess to have knowledge, and about which you are ready to get up and advise as if you knew, are you not ashamed, when you are asked, not to be able to answer the question? Is it not disgraceful? Alcibiades: very. Socrates: well then, consider and try to explain what is the meaning of better in the matter of making peace and going to war with those against whom you ought to go to war, to what does the word refer? Alcibiades: I am thinking, and I cannot tell. Socrates: But you surely know what are the charges which we bring against one another when we arrive at the point of making war, and what name we give them? Alcibiades: Yes, certainly. We say that deceit or violence has been employed, or that we have been defrauded. Socrates: And how does this happen? Will you tell me how? For there may be a difference in the manner. Alcibiades: Do you mean by how, Socrates, whether we suffered these things justly or unjustly? Socrates: Exactly. Alcibiades: There can be no greater difference than between just and unjust. Socrates: And would you advise the Athenians to go to war with the just or with the unjust? Alcibiades: That is an awkward question, for certainly, even if a person did intend to go to war with the just, he would not admit that they were just. Socrates: He would not go to war because it would be unlawful. Alcibiades: Neither lawful nor honorable. Socrates: Then you, too, would address them on principles of justice? Alcibiades: Certainly. Socrates: What then is justice but that better of which I spoke, in going to war or not going to war with those against whom we ought or ought not, and when we ought or ought not to go to war? Alcibiades: Clearly. Socrates: But how is this, friend Alcibiades? Have you forgotten that you do not know this? Or have you been to the schoolmaster without my knowledge? And has he taught you to discern the just from the unjust? Who is he? I wish you would tell me, that I may go and learn of him. You shall introduce me. Alcibiades: You are mocking, Socrates. Socrates: No, indeed. I most solemnly declare to you by Zeus, who is the God of our common friendship, and whom I never will forswear, that I am not. Tell me then who this instructor is, if he exists. Alcibiades: But perhaps he does not exist. May I not have acquired the knowledge of just and unjust in some other way? Socrates: Yes, if you have discovered them. Alcibiades: But do you not think that I could discover them? Socrates: I am sure that you might, if you inquired about them. Alcibiades: And do you not think that I would inquire? Socrates: Yes, if you thought that you did not know them. Alcibiades: And was there not a time when I did so think? Socrates: Very good. And can you tell me how long it is since you thought that you did not know the nature of the just and the unjust? What do you say to a year ago? Were you then in a state of conscious ignorance and enquiry? Or did you think that you knew, and please to answer truly, that our discussion may not be in vain? Alcibiades: Well, I thought that I knew. Socrates: And 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, and 4 years ago, you knew all the same? Alcibiades: I did. Socrates: And more than 4 years ago, you were a child, were you not? Alcibiades: Yes. Socrates: And then I am quite sure that you thought you knew. Alcibiades: Why are you so sure? Socrates: Because I often heard you, when a child, in your teacher's house or elsewhere, playing at dice or some other game with the boys, not hesitating at all about the nature of the just and unjust, but very confident, crying and shouting that one of the boys was a rogue and a cheat, and had been cheating. Is it not true? Alcibiades: But what was I to do, Socrates, when anybody cheated me? Socrates: And how can you say, what was I to do, if at the time you did not know whether you were wronged or not? Alcibiades: To be sure I knew. I was quite aware that I was being cheated. Socrates, then you suppose yourself, even when a child, to have known the nature of just and unjust. Alcibiades, certainly, and I did know then. Socrates, and when did you discover them? Not, surely, at the time when you thought that you knew them. Alcibiades, certainly not. Socrates, and when did you think that you were ignorant? If you consider, you will find that there never was such a time. Alcibiades, really, Socrates, I cannot say. Socrates, then you did not learn them by discovering them. Alcibiades, clearly not. Socrates, but just before you said that you did not know them by learning. Now, if you have neither discovered nor learned them, how and whence do you come to know them? Alcibiades, I suppose that I was mistaken in saying that I knew them through my own discovery of them, whereas in truth I learned them in the same way that other people learn. Socrates, so you said before, and I must again ask, of whom? Do tell me. Alcibiades, of the many. Socrates, do you take refuge in them? I cannot say much for your teachers. Alcibiades, why? Are they not able to teach? Socrates, they could not teach you how to play at draughts, which you would acknowledge, would you not, to be a much smaller matter than justice? Alcibiades, yes. Socrates, and can they teach the better who are unable to teach the worse? Alcibiades, I think that they can. At any rate, they can teach many far better things than to play at draughts. Socrates, what things? Alcibiades, why, for example, I learned to speak Greek of them, and I cannot say who was my teacher, or to whom I am to attribute my knowledge of Greek, if not to those good-for-nothing teachers, as you call them. Socrates, why, yes, my friend, and the many are good enough teachers of Greek, and some of their instructions in that line may be justly praised. Alcibiades, why is that? Socrates, why, because they have the qualities which good teachers ought to have. Alcibiades, what qualities? Socrates, why, you know that knowledge is the first qualification of any teacher. Alcibiades, certainly. Socrates, and if they know, they must agree together and not differ. Alcibiades, yes. Socrates, and would you say that they knew the things about which they differ? Alcibiades, no. Socrates, then how can they teach them? Alcibiades, they cannot. Socrates, well, but do you imagine that the many would differ about the nature of wood and stone? Are they not agreed if you ask them what they are? And do they not run to fetch the same thing when they want a piece of wood or a stone? And so in similar cases, which I suspect to be pretty nearly all that you mean by speaking Greek. Alcibiades, true. Socrates, these, as we were saying, are matters about which they are agreed with one another and with themselves. Both individuals and states use the same words about them. They do not use some one word and some another. Alcibiades, they do not. Socrates, then they may be expected to be good teachers of these things. Alcibiades, yes. Socrates, and if we want to instruct any one in them, we shall be right in sending him to be taught by our friends, the many. Alcibiades, very true. Socrates, but if we wanted further to know, not only which are men and which are horses, but which men or horses have powers of running, would the many still be able to inform us? Alcibiades, certainly not. Socrates, and you have a sufficient proof that they do not know these things, and are not the best teachers of them, inasmuch as they are never agreed about them. Alcibiades, yes. Socrates, and suppose that we wanted to know not only what men are like, but what healthy or diseased men are like, would the many be able to teach us? Alcibiades, they would not. Socrates, and you would have a proof that they were bad teachers of these matters, if you saw them at variance. Alcibiades, I should. Socrates, well, but are the many agreed with themselves, or with one another, about the justice or injustice of men and things? Alcibiades, assuredly not, Socrates. Socrates, there is no subject about which they are more at variance. Alcibiades, none. Socrates, I do not suppose that you ever saw or heard of men quarrelling over the principles of health and disease, to such an extent as to go to war and kill one another for the sake of them. Alcibiades, no indeed. Socrates, but of the quarrels about justice and injustice, even if you have never seen them, you have certainly heard from many people, including Homer, for you have heard of the Iliad and Odyssey. Alcibiades, to be sure, Socrates. Socrates, a difference of just and unjust is the argument of those poems. Alcibiades, true. Socrates, which difference caused all the wars and deaths of Trojans and Achaeans, and the deaths of the suitors of Penelope in their quarrel with Odysseus? Alcibiades, very true. Socrates, and when the Athenians and Lacedaemonians and Boeotians fell at Tanagra, and afterwards in the battle of Coronea, at which your father, Cleinias, met his end, the question was one of justice. This was the sole cause of the battles and of their deaths. Alcibiades, very true. Socrates, but can they be said to understand that about which they are quarrelling to the death? Alcibiades, clearly not. Socrates, and yet those whom you thus allow to be ignorant are the teachers to whom you are appealing. Alcibiades, very true. Socrates, but how are you ever likely to know the nature of justice and injustice, about which you are so perplexed, if you have neither learned them of others nor discovered them yourself? Alcibiades, from what you say, I suppose not. Socrates, see again how inaccurately you speak, Alcibiades. Alcibiades, in what respect? Socrates, in saying that I say so. Alcibiades, why, did you not say that I know nothing of the just and unjust? Socrates, no, I did not. Alcibiades, did I then? Socrates, yes. Alcibiades, how was that? Socrates, let me explain. Suppose I were to ask you which is the greater number, 2 or 1. You would reply 2. Alcibiades, I should. Socrates, and by how much greater? Alcibiades, by 1. Socrates, which of us now says that 2 is more than 1? Alcibiades, I do. Socrates, did not I ask, and you answer the question? Alcibiades, yes. Socrates, then who is speaking? I who put the question, or you who answer me? Alcibiades, I am. Socrates, or suppose that I ask and you tell me the letters which make up the name Socrates. Which of us is the speaker? Alcibiades, I am. Socrates, now let us put the case generally. Whenever there is a question and answer, who is the speaker, the questioner, or the answerer? Alcibiades, I should say, Socrates, that the answerer was the speaker. Socrates, and have I not been the questioner all through? Alcibiades, yes. Socrates, and you the answerer? Alcibiades, just so. Socrates, which of us then was the speaker? Alcibiades, the inference is, Socrates, that I was the speaker. Socrates, did not someone say that Alcibiades, the fair son of Cleinias, not understanding about just and unjust, but thinking that he did understand, was going to the assembly to advise the Athenians about what he did not know? Was not that said? Alcibiades, very true. Socrates, then, Alcibiades, the result may be expressed in the language of Euripides. I think that you have heard all this from yourself, and not from me. Nor did I say this, which you erroneously attribute to me, but you yourself, and what you said was very true. For indeed, my dear fellow, the design which you meditate of teaching what you do not know, and have not taken any pains to learn, is downright insanity. Alcibiades: But Socrates, I think that the Athenians and the rest of the Hellenes do not often advise as to the more just or unjust, for they see no difficulty in them, and therefore they leave them, and consider which course of action will be most expedient. For there is a difference between justice and expediency. Many persons have done great wrong and profited by their injustice. Others have done rightly and come to no good. Socrates: Well, but granting that the just and the expedient are ever so much opposed, you surely do not imagine that you know what is expedient for mankind, or why a thing is expedient. Alcibiades: Why not, Socrates? But I am not going to be asked again from whom I learned, or when I made the discovery. Socrates: What a way you have! When you make a mistake which might be refuted by a previous argument, you insist on having a new and different refutation. The old argument is a worn-out garment which you will no longer put on, but someone must produce another which is clean and new. Now I shall disregard this move of yours, and shall ask over again, where did you learn, and how do you know the nature of the expedient, and who is your teacher? All this I comprehend in a single question, and now you will manifestly be in the old difficulty, and will not be able to show that you know the expedient, either because you learned, or because you discovered it yourself. But, as I perceive that you are dainty, and dislike the taste of a stale argument, I will inquire no further into your knowledge of what is expedient, or what is not expedient for the Athenian people, and simply request you to say why you do not explain whether justice and expediency are the same or different. And if you like, you may examine me as I have examined you, or, if you would rather, you may carry on the discussion by yourself. Alcibiades: But I am not certain, Socrates, whether I shall be able to discuss the matter with you. Socrates: Then imagine, my dear fellow, that I am the Demus and the Ecclesia, for in the Ecclesia too you will have to persuade men individually. Alcibiades: Yes. Socrates: And is not the same person able to persuade one individual singly and many individuals of the things which he knows? The grammarian, for example, can persuade one, and he can persuade many about letters. Alcibiades: True. Socrates: And about number, will not the same person persuade one and persuade many? Alcibiades: Yes. Socrates: And this will be he who knows number, or the arithmetician. Alcibiades: Quite true. Socrates: And cannot you persuade one man about that of which you can persuade many? Alcibiades: I suppose so. Socrates: And that of which you can persuade either is clearly what you know? Alcibiades: Yes. Socrates: And the only difference between one who argues as we are doing, and the orator who is addressing an assembly, is that the one seeks to persuade a number, and the other an individual, of the same things. Alcibiades: I suppose so. Socrates: Well then, since the same person who can persuade a multitude can persuade individuals, try conclusions upon me, and prove to me that the just is not always expedient. Alcibiades: You take liberties, Socrates. Socrates: I shall take the liberty of proving to you the opposite of that which you will not prove to me. Alcibiades: Proceed. Socrates: Answer my questions, that is all. Alcibiades: Nay, I should like you to be the speaker. Socrates: What? Do you not wish to be persuaded? Alcibiades: Certainly I do. Socrates: And can you be persuaded better than out of your own mouth? Alcibiades: I think not.